charging system, let's look at that a second, and that's pretty simple. You can see we're running 14.1, 14.2 volts. Now, one of the challenges in this swap was making everything work the way it should. And modern vehicles have what they call smart charging. What that means is a module monitors the voltage throughout the system, and that could be the ABS module, the TIPM. Well, the TIPM is actually what monitors everything, and then it sets a charge goal, because if you're driving down the road at 70, going down a hill, you're going to have a different charge strategy than if you're idling with the air conditioning on and all the accessories on. So we wanted to maintain that, and we actually run the Jeep alternator because we can maintain the smart charging, keep it in a closed loop, which means the computer sets a desired charge goal and then looks at the actual and compares the two, and then makes corrections. You may not think that's a big deal, but this also keeps the light on the dash functional and extends the battery life. To put a GM alternator on and simply run it open loop, most of the Gen 4 alternators will go into a limp mode if they don't have a GEM module to 13.8 volts and just stay there. And will it work? Yes, we've actually done swaps where we've done that. You can also use the earlier alternators, the 4-wire alternators, and get them to run 14 volts. But maintaining the smart charging is a good thing. This Jeep has a battery that was 5 years old. We put it in when we did the swap, and I just replaced it before I went on this trip. Not because it was bad, but it was starting to get weak. And 5 years in the Las Vegas summers is asking a lot from a battery. And I firmly believe that it went that long because of the smart charging and the fact that we keep the engine compartment cool with this LS. We do not, unlike the Hemi, we do not cut the firewall. We do not remove the heat shields between the battery and the engine or the TIPM, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the battery stays cool, lasts longer, does not have to be relocated. It's just less work for you to do. We've done some supercharged builds, or actually where we removed superchargers to put LSs in, and we end up rebuilding all that. We end up installing the battery trays and shields. To leave a battery exposed to the exhaust manifold and the heat, it's gonna take the life out of that battery. So the TIPM, on the other hand, is also known as a gateway module in the Chrysler world, and it's responsible for a lot of things, including engine management. It controls the fuel pump and other functions. So if it goes down, you pretty much get stuck. And fortunately, with the LS, we do have the option to go into a standalone mode, which means we can run without the TIPM being functional. We bypass the fuel pump relay so that we can get around that. But with like a Hemi or some of the supercharged builds, they take all that shielding out and they expose the bottom of the TIPM, which is essentially a computer, to all the heat of the exhaust. And again, we've had customers year after year come into our shop with Hemis that have melted down the TIPM and they need to be replaced. With the LS, of course, we leave all the heat shields in place. The TIPM is well protected, and there's rarely a failure. So let's go now to this next page. Okay, what we're looking at here is the O2 switching, and you can see they're switching pretty hard. Most modern vehicles, starting in around 1981, went to OBD1, Onboard Diagnostics 1, which required the feds required certain parameters. The engine computer had to store emissions-related codes. OBD2, of course, is much more stringent, and enhanced OBD2 even more than that. But basically, going to the closed-loop feedback system with an oxygen sensor started off in the 70s. Bosch did it, in the early Cadillacs had it. Some of the German vehicles had it. But basically, placing an oxygen sensor in the exhaust system, close to the exhaust manifold, allowed a computer to monitor the oxygen content in the exhaust. And it's been determined that stoichiometric, or the most efficient air-fuel ratio for the least amount of emissions and the best performance is stoichiometric, which is 14.7 to 1 approximately, with pure gasoline. You start throwing alcohol in there and it drops. Most of us are running about 14.2 to 1 with 10% ethanol. So by putting the oxygen sensor in the exhaust, we know that around 1.5% oxygen is stoichiometric. So they set the narrow band. A narrow band oxygen sensor can only sense stoich. It can't sense anything else, unlike a wide band. So we can't really use it as an air-fuel ratio sensor. So by putting this oxygen sensor in and looking for 1.5% O2 in the exhaust, and oxygen does not get transformed throughout the combustion process. We got hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, nitrogen going into the primary intake of the engine. There's also secondary air, but for the primary air, we have all this coming in, and then we got stuff coming out. With catalytic converters, we got CO, which is carbon monoxide. We have HCs, which is hydrocarbons. We have NO1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is NOx. NO4 is photochemical smog, which they figured out a while back was responsible for that haze, especially in valleys like the LA basin. So what we want is good gases to come out, like H2O, which is water, CO2. There's some greenhouse gases, but basically we wanted good gases to come out. So with the oxygen sensor, we can keep it at stoich. The ECM, or the module, monitors the oxygen content, and then in general, most narrowbands run from 0 to 1 volt, and 450 millivolts, which is 0.450, is stoich. The injectors are your output, so the computer looks at the O2 and says, okay, I'm at 300 millivolts, I'm lean, so it adds a little bit extra fuel. Now it jumps up over 450 and it goes up to about 700 or 800 millivolts, and the computer says, hey, I'm rich, and now it brings back the injector pulse width. So by switching, constantly going up, above and below stoich, we maintain that 14.68 or 14.7 air-fuel ratio, and now we can get the best economy with the best performance and lowest emissions. And it's a pretty amazing system, because if you change fuels, if you start putting alcohol in it, the system has a certain amount of flexibility. Stoichiometric for every fuel is different. Diesel is different than gasoline, and gasoline is different than alcohol. Alcohol's down around 9 to 1. But we can always monitor that oxygen and know what the optimal stoich is for each fuel or blend of fuel. When you start putting too much alcohol in an engine, if the engine is not designed for it, the injectors are not big enough, they cannot provide enough fuel, and you're going to run lean. You're going to start throwing PO 174s, 171s, and you don't want to do that. So the closed loop feedback system, Motors decided to join us. The closed loop feedback system is very important, and monitoring the output of these oxygen sensors is critical, and that's what I'm doing with most of my test drives. I can tell if the engine's rich, I can tell if it's flatlining lean. Now you will see these signals flatline when you go into open loop, such as on the earlier operating systems we had lean cruise where it'd bring it down to 16, 17, 18 to 1 air-fuel ratios, and you'll see the O2's flatline low. Performance enrichment, you'll see it flatline rich, because now we're bringing the air-fuel ratio down to about 11 to 12 to 1 for the best performance. And then there's other open loop conditions too, cold start, hot modes, and by looking at these O2 sensors I can tell exactly what the engine is doing. So I've gabbed enough. We'll come back a little bit later.